The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored paper with gold embossing that felt expensive between my fingers. Madison Elizabeth Hayes requests the honor of your presence at her wedding to James Michael Richardson. The same Madison who used to trace patterns on my chest during lazy Sunday mornings, who promised we'd build something beautiful together. The same Madison who walked away 3 months ago, claiming I lacked ambition, direction, purpose. I stared at the invitation until the elegant script blurred. Why would she invite me? Perhaps cruelty disguised as courtesy. Perhaps she wanted to parade her upgrade in front of me, James Richardson, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Apex, whose trust fund could buy and sell my entire existence without causing a ripple in his bank account. But as I held that invitation, something shifted inside me. A recognition that this moment would define everything that came after. The old me would have declined, would have spent the evening drinking cheap beer and wallowing in self-pity. The new me, the me that was still becoming, had different plans entirely. I reached for my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized but never called. The voice that answered was smooth, professional, expectant. As if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. I'd like to make a purchase, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Something that will make an impression. 3 days later, I stood in the bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie that cost more than my monthly rent. The reflection staring back at me looked like a stranger, confident, polished, dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. The suit had been delivered that morning, tailored to measurements I'd never provided, fitting as if it had been made for a version of myself I'd never known existed. The wedding was being held at the Prestonwood Country Club, naturally. Madison had always been drawn to symbols of status, and the Richardson family wielded symbols like weapons. I'd driven past the club countless times during our relationship, always as an outsider looking in. Today would be different. I checked my watch, a sleek silver piece that had appeared in my mailbox without explanation, like so many things lately. Time moved differently now, each moment pregnant with possibility and dread. The old patterns of my life were dissolving, replaced by something I couldn't yet name but could feel reshaping me from the inside out. The drive to the country club passed in a blur of manicured landscapes and gates that opened before I could announce myself. The attendant waved me through with a knowing smile, as if I belonged there, as if I'd always belonged there. I parked in the guest lot, my hands trembling slightly as I turned off the engine. Madison's friends were already arriving, women in pastel dresses and men in expensive suits, all laughing and embracing with the easy intimacy of people who'd never questioned their place in the world. I recognized several faces from our college days: Emily Chin, who'd started her own marketing firm, Ryan Thompson, who'd married into pharmaceutical money, Sarah Kim, who'd always treated me like Madison's unfortunate charity case. They noticed me immediately, their conversation stuttering to a halt as I approached. Emily recovered first, her smile too bright, too practiced. "Oh my goodness, it's been forever. How have you been?" Her eyes scanned my appearance, cataloging details, searching for flaws in my transformation. "I've been well," I replied, enjoying the way uncertainty flickered across her features. "Really well, actually." Ryan stepped forward, extending his hand with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to establishing dominance through physical contact. His grip was firm, intentionally so, but I matched it without effort. Something in my expression must have shifted because he released my hand quickly, his bravado faltering. "So what have you been up to?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the particular edge reserved for people she considered beneath her social station. "Still working at that little tech company?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. In the old life, I would have mumbled something about transitional phases and searching for the right opportunity. But that person felt increasingly distant, like a character from a book I'd once read but could barely remember. "I've moved on to something more specialized," I said, letting the words carry their own weight. "Something that better suits my particular talents." Before anyone could probe deeper, the ceremony music began. We filed into the country club's main hall, where white flowers cascaded from crystal chandeliers and Madison's dreams of elegance had been rendered in silk and gold. I took a seat near the back, close enough to observe, far enough to remain peripheral. The guests settled into their places with the choreographed precision of people who attended such events regularly. Old money mixed with new money, political connections networked with business partnerships, and everyone understood their role in the elaborate theater of Southern high society. Everyone except me. But as I sat there, watching the pre-ceremony ritual unfold, I realized I no longer felt like an outsider. I felt like an observer, Someone studying the patterns and structures of a world I was learning to navigate in entirely new ways. Madison appeared at the end of the aisle like a vision from a magazine spread, her dress a waterfall of French lace and seed pearls that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She moved with practiced grace, her smile radiant and perfectly calculated for the photographer capturing every moment. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of everything she'd worked toward since we'd met in college. But as she passed my row, her eyes found mine, and for just an instant, the mask slipped. I saw confusion there, and something that might have been fear. I looked different, not just the clothes and the confident posture, but something deeper. Something that made her pause mid-step before catching herself and continuing toward the altar where James waited. James Richardson stood at the altar like a monument to inherited privilege, his smile confident and uncomplicated. He was exactly what Madison had always wanted. Handsome in a conventional way, wealthy in a generational way, safe in a way that promised comfort without challenge. He represented everything I wasn't, everything I could never be. Or at least, everything the old me could never be. The ceremony proceeded with the predictable rhythm of traditional weddings. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together, about the sacred bonds that unite two souls. The words washed over me like white noise, meaningless platitudes that had nothing to do with the reality of what was happening. I found myself studying the guests instead, cataloging their reactions, their body language, their unguarded moments. Emily kept glancing at her phone, probably managing some crisis at her marketing firm. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expensive suit unable to hide the signs of too many business lunches. Sarah maintained her practiced smile, while her eyes constantly scanned the room, ever alert for social opportunities. These were Madison's people now, her chosen family, the witnesses to her transformation from the girl who'd once shared cheap pizza with me in our cramped apartment to the woman who was marrying into one of Apex's most prominent families. The trajectory of her life had been carefully plotted, each relationship and achievement a stepping stone toward this moment. But trajectories could be altered. Destinies could be rewritten. I was learning that truth in ways I'd never imagined possible. The vows were traditional, borrowed from centuries of couples who'd stood in similar circumstances and made similar promises. Madison's voice carried clearly through the hall, each word precisely enunciated, each phrase delivered with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. James responded with equal precision, his voice carrying the weight of his family's expectations. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was enthusiastic but restrained, appropriate to the setting and the social caliber of the attendees. I clapped along with everyone else, my hands creating a rhythm that felt disconnected from my thoughts. The recessional began, and Madison and James made their way back down the aisle, beaming at their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes with practiced grace. As they passed my row, Madison's eyes found mine again, and this time there was no mistaking the unease in her expression. She leaned toward James, whispering something that made him glance in my direction. His smile faltered for just a moment, confusion replacing confidence as he tried to place me, to understand why his new wife seemed disturbed by my presence. But the moment passed, and they continued their triumphant exit, leaving me to consider the first phase of what I was beginning to understand was a much larger transformation. The cocktail hour gave me time to observe and plan. The country club's terrace overlooked perfectly manicured grounds where a few early guests mingled with drinks and appetizers. The conversations were predictable: business deals, mutual acquaintances, vacation plans to European destinations. The language of privilege spoken by people who'd never questioned their right to speak it. I moved through the crowd with increasing confidence, my transformation becoming more complete with each interaction. The expensive suit, the confident posture, the way I held my drink, everything combined to create an impression of someone who belonged, someone who mattered. "I don't think we've met," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed, with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "I'm Patricia Richardson, James's mother." The introduction carried weight, an assertion of status and an invitation to explain myself. Patricia Richardson was old money aristocracy, The kind of woman who'd been trained from birth to identify threats to her family's position and neutralize them with surgical precision. "Pleasure to meet you," I replied, extending my hand. "I'm an old friend of Madison's from college." Her handshake was firm, her smile polite but measuring. "How wonderful that you could join us for this special day. And what is it that you do?" The question was innocuous on its surface but loaded with implications. She was placing me in her mental catalog, determining whether I was worth cultivating or dismissing. In the old life, I would have fumbled through an explanation of my modest job and uncertain prospects. But that person was fading, replaced by someone more interesting. "I'm in acquisitions," I said, letting the vagueness speak for itself. "I help people obtain things they didn't know they wanted." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of interest mixed with wariness. "How intriguing. And what sort of things do you help people acquire?" "Opportunities, mostly. Experiences. Sometimes perspective." I paused, allowing the words to settle. I find that people often underestimate their own potential until someone shows them what's possible. Before she could respond, the dinner bell chimed, and we were invited to move into the main dining room. The reception was a masterpiece of event planning, with round tables draped in ivory linen and centerpieces that belonged in museum displays. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back, not quite exile, but definitely not the inner circle. My table mates were a mix of distant relatives and college acquaintances, people who occupied the social periphery of Madison's new world. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone trying to establish their connection to the bride and groom, their reason for being included in this exclusive celebration. But as the evening progressed and the wine flowed, inhibitions loosened and true personalities emerged. David Martinez, a college friend who'd struggled to find his footing after graduation, complained bitterly about his student loans and dead-end job. Jennifer Walsh, Madison's former roommate, gossiped about mutual acquaintances with the vicious precision of someone who'd been excluded from more desirable social circles. I listened to their complaints and frustrations with growing fascination. These were people who'd accepted their limitations, who'd settled for less than they dreamed of achieving. They were living proof of the paths not taken, the choices that led to disappointment and regret. "You're being awfully quiet," Jennifer said, turning her attention to me. "I remember you being more talkative back in college." The observation was meant to be cutting, a reminder of my previous social awkwardness. But I found myself smiling at the memory of who I'd been, how far I'd traveled from that uncertain young man who desperately wanted to fit in. "I've learned to listen more carefully," I replied. "You'd be surprised what you can learn when you pay attention to what people really want." David laughed, but there was an edge to it. "And what do you think we really want?" I looked around the table, studying each face, seeing the hunger beneath their polished exteriors. Recognition. Respect. The chance to matter, to be seen as more than you are right now. The table fell silent, my words cutting closer to the truth than anyone expected. Jennifer's smile became strained, David's laughter died away, and the other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "That's quite the philosophy," David said finally. "Speaking from experience?" "In a way," I admitted. "I've recently learned that change is possible for people who want it badly enough. The question is how far you're willing to go to get what you deserve." The speeches began after the main course, a parade of family members and friends sharing carefully crafted anecdotes about Madison and James's love story. Each speaker hit the same notes: their perfect compatibility, their bright future, their role as a couple who represented the best of their generation. James's best man, a college friend named Tyler Brooks, delivered a speech full of inside jokes and references to shared adventures. He painted James as a natural leader, someone who'd always been destined for success, someone who'd found his perfect match in Madison. When it was time for the maid of honor to speak, Emily Chin took the microphone with the confidence of someone comfortable in the spotlight. Her speech was more polished, more strategic, positioning Madison as an inspiration to ambitious women everywhere. She spoke about Madison's determination, her refusal to settle for less than she deserved, her ability to recognize quality when she found it. The words stung, but not in the way they would have 3 months ago. Now they felt like validation of choices I was only beginning to understand. Madison had indeed refused to settle, had recognized what she considered quality. The fact that I hadn't met her standards then was simply information, data to be processed and acted upon. As the speeches concluded and the dancing began, I made my way to the bar, where I ordered a drink and studied the crowd. The reception was reaching its peak energy, with couples swaying to romantic ballads and groups of friends laughing over shared memories. It was a beautiful evening, a perfect celebration of love and commitment. But perfection, I was learning, was often fragile. I can't believe you actually came. I turned to find Madison approaching, her wedding dress rustling with each step. Up close, she looked even more radiant than she had during the ceremony, but there was tension in her posture, uncertainty in her eyes. You invited me, I replied simply. I didn't think you'd accept. I thought. She paused, searching for words. You look different. Really different. People change, I said, taking a sip of my drink. Sometimes more than you'd expect. She studied my face, trying to reconcile the person standing before her with the man she'd known. What happened to you? Where did you get that suit? That watch? You never had money for things like that. I found new opportunities, I said. New ways of thinking about what's possible. What kind of opportunities? There was something desperate in her voice, a need to understand and categorize what she was seeing. Before I could answer, James appeared at her side, his arm sliding possessively around her waist. He was still handsome, still confident, but there was something different about his expression as he looked at me, a wariness that hadn't been there during the ceremony. Madison, honey, people are looking for you, he said, his voice carefully controlled. We should get back to our guests. Of course, she said, but her eyes remained fixed on me. It was good to see you again. I hope you're happy with whatever it is you're doing now. I'm becoming very happy, I replied. More than I ever imagined possible. As they walked away, I noticed James lean down to whisper something in Madison's ear. She nodded but kept glancing back at me, confusion and something that might have been regret playing across her features. The evening was reaching its climax, but I sensed that the real performance was just beginning. The moment came during the bouquet toss, when all the unmarried women gathered on the dance floor with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Madison positioned herself at the center of the group, her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath held high above her head. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the ritual unfold, when I felt my phone vibrate. The message was brief, just an address and a time, but it sent a surge of electricity through my system. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Madison threw the bouquet high into the air, and it seemed to hang there for a moment, suspended in the golden light of the chandeliers. The women below reached upward, their faces bright with hope and playful competition. When the flowers finally fell, they landed in the hands of a young woman I didn't recognize, someone's cousin or friend who squealed with delight as the crowd applauded. But I was no longer watching the celebration. I was moving toward the exit, my part in this particular performance complete. The real show was about to begin outside. The country club's valet stand was busy with guests coming and going, but I walked past the attendants to the far end of the parking lot where I'd left my car. Except it wasn't my car anymore. In its place sat something that made me stop and stare. The Lamborghini Huracan was painted in a deep metallic blue that seemed to shift and change in the evening light. Every line of the vehicle spoke of power and precision, of engineering excellence and artistic vision. It was not just a car, it was a statement, a declaration, a promise of possibilities that most people never dared to imagine. The keys were in my hand, though I couldn't remember picking them up. They felt warm, almost alive, perfectly weighted for their purpose. I approached the vehicle with something approaching reverence, my fingers trailing along its perfect surface. Behind me, I heard voices, the sound of guests beginning to leave the reception. Some had noticed the Lamborghini and were making appreciative comments, speculating about which guest owned such an impressive machine. The conversations grew louder as more people emerged from the country club, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic pull of obvious wealth. I climbed into the driver's seat, and the interior embraced me like a second skin. The leather was supple and warm, the controls perfectly positioned for my hands. When I turned the key, the engine responded with a growl that sent vibrations through my entire body, a sound that spoke of barely contained power. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and I could see familiar faces among them, Emily, Ryan, Sarah, and others from the wedding party. They watched with obvious envy and curiosity as I adjusted the mirrors and familiarized myself with the controls. Then I saw Madison and James emerge from the country club, still in their wedding attire, his arm around her waist in a gesture that now seemed more protective than affectionate. They stopped when they saw the crowd gathered around the Lamborghini, confusion replacing their newlywed contentment. Madison's eyes found mine through the windshield, and I saw recognition dawn on her face. The color drained from her cheeks as she realized who was sitting behind the wheel of the most expensive car in the parking lot. I rolled down the window and made eye contact with her across the distance. The look on her face was everything I had hoped for: shock, disbelief, and something that might have been regret. She whispered something to James, who looked from her to me and back again, his confidence cracking like a facade. The engine's rumble grew louder as I pressed the accelerator, the sound cutting through the evening air like a challenge. Every head turned in my direction, every conversation stopped, every assumption about who I was and what I represented shattered in the space of a heartbeat. I had arrived at the wedding as the man Madison had discarded, the nobody she deemed unworthy of her time and ambition. I was leaving as someone else entirely, someone who commanded attention and respect, someone who clearly had access to resources that dwarfed even the Richardson family's considerable wealth. As I pulled away from the country club, I caught one last glimpse of Madison in my rearview mirror. She was standing frozen in the parking lot, her perfect wedding dress billowing in the evening breeze, watching the taillights of my Lamborghini disappear into the night. The old me would have felt satisfaction at her obvious shock and confusion. But the person I was becoming felt something else entirely, a cool detachment, an appreciation for the elegant precision of the moment, and a growing awareness that this was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The next morning brought a flood of messages and calls that I ignored with increasing amusement. Madison had somehow obtained my new number and left a series of increasingly frantic voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. The first was tentative, almost casual. "Hey, it's me. I just wanted to say thank you for coming to the wedding. Call me back when you get this." The second carried more urgency. "I really need to talk to you. That car. Where did you get that car? Please call me back." By the fourth message, her composure had completely cracked. "I don't understand what's happening. Who are you now? What did you do? James is asking questions I can't answer, and I need to know what's going on." I listened to each message with detached interest, like a researcher studying behavioral patterns. The transformation in her voice across those few hours told a story of crumbling certainty, of a worldview that no longer made sense. The man she dismissed as a nobody had somehow acquired the symbols of success that her new husband's trust fund could barely match. But the calls weren't just from Madison. Emily Chin had also reached out, her message carefully crafted to sound casual while fishing for information. Sarah Kim had sent a friend request on social media along with a message about getting together for drinks. Even Ryan Thompson, who'd barely acknowledged my existence at the wedding, left a voicemail about potential business opportunities. The sudden attention was intoxicating, but it also felt hollow. These people hadn't changed, I had. They were still the same status-obsessed individuals who'd treated me like furniture for years. The only difference was their perception of my value, which had shifted dramatically based on nothing more than an expensive car and a well-tailored suit. I spent the morning in my apartment, which now felt small and temporary, like a hotel room rather than a home. The lease was month to month, the furniture was borrowed or bought secondhand, and the entire space could be packed into boxes in an afternoon. It was the kind of place you lived in when you were waiting for your real life to begin. But my real life was beginning, just not in the way I'd once imagined. Around noon, I drove the Lamborghini to a coffee shop in downtown Apex, parking it in front of the large windows where it would be visible to anyone inside. The effect was immediate, conversation stopped, heads turned, and the barista's demeanor shifted from bored indifference to eager attention. I ordered a simple coffee and took a seat near the window, close enough to my car to make the connection obvious. Within minutes, I was approached by a steady stream of admirers, each one eager to make conversation with the owner of such an impressive vehicle. A real estate agent named Michael Davis handed me his card and talked about luxury properties coming on the market. A financial advisor named Lisa Chin offered to help me diversify my portfolio. A young entrepreneur named Kevin Park pitched me on his tech startup, clearly assuming I was the kind of person who made angel investments. Each interaction followed the same pattern: initial admiration for the car, followed by probing questions about my business, then offers of partnership or service. I responded to each with the same vague confidence, letting them project their own assumptions onto my deliberately ambiguous answers. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice something unsettling. My reflection in the coffee shop's windows looked different each time I glanced at it. Sharper somehow, more defined, as if the person I was becoming was literally reshaping my physical appearance. My jawline seemed more prominent, my eyes more intense, my overall presence more commanding. When I finally left the coffee shop, the Lamborghini felt like an extension of my body, responding to my thoughts as much as my actions. The drive home was a blur of sensation and speed, the city flowing past like a river of light and possibility. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the day's events, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The old boundaries between who I was and who I wanted to be were dissolving, replaced by something more fluid, more powerful, more dangerous. My phone buzzed with another message from Madison, but I didn't need to read it to know its contents. She was beginning to understand that the man she'd known was gone, replaced by someone she couldn't recognize or control. The question was whether I could control him either. The calls and messages continued for days, but they began to change in tone and content. Madison's desperate attempts to reconnect gave way to something darker, more accusatory. She'd been asking questions, conducting her own investigation into my sudden transformation. "I know you're hiding something," her latest voicemail declared. "Nobody changes that much that fast. Nobody just suddenly has money for cars like that. Whatever you're involved in, whatever you've done, I'm going to find out." The threat should have worried me, but instead it filled me with a strange excitement. Madison had always been perceptive, always good at reading people and situations. If she was beginning to suspect that something was wrong, it meant the transformation was more complete than I'd realized. I was no longer pretending to be someone else. I was becoming someone else. The realization hit me during a meeting with my bank manager, a nervous man named Robert Hayes who'd summoned me to discuss some irregularities in my account. I sat across from his desk in my expensive suit, watching him fumble through paperwork with trembling hands. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there have been some unusual deposits in your account. Large amounts from sources that, well, they're difficult to trace." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lab rat. "Is that a problem?" "Not exactly a problem, but we're required to report certain types of transactions to federal authorities. For your protection, of course, and to ensure compliance with anti-money laundering regulations." "Of course," I agreed, noting how his hand shook as he reached for a glass of water. "And have you made these reports?" "Well, that's the thing," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Every time I try to file the paperwork, something happens. My computer crashes, or the forms disappear, or I forget what I was doing. It's the strangest thing." I smiled, and something in that expression made him flinch. "Technology can be unreliable." "Yes, exactly. Very unreliable." He paused, studying my face as if seeing it for the first time. "You look different than when you opened the account. More substantial." "People change," I said, using the phrase that had become my standard response to such observations. "Yes, but usually not this dramatically. Usually not this quickly." He leaned forward, his voice becoming conspiratorial. "Between you and me, I've been having dreams about you. Strange dreams where you're not entirely human." The admission hung in the air between us, too bizarre for normal conversation, but somehow perfectly logical in the context of my new reality. I studied Robert Hayes with renewed interest, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands moved independently of his conscious will, the subtle tremor in his voice that suggested he was fighting against something he couldn't name or understand. "Dreams can be very revealing," I said finally. "They show us truths we're not ready to face during waking hours." "What are you?" he whispered, the question emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I'm exactly what you think I am," I replied, rising from my chair with fluid grace. "The question is whether you're ready to accept what that means." I left him sitting behind his desk, staring at the paperwork that would never be filed, caught in a loop of confusion and dread that would grow stronger with each passing day. As I walked through the bank's marble lobby, I noticed other employees watching me with the same mixture of fascination and fear I'd seen in Robert's eyes. The transformation was accelerating, becoming visible to anyone who looked closely enough. But instead of concern, I felt only anticipation. The old world, with its rules and limitations, was falling away. Something new was taking its place, something that made the impossible not only possible, but inevitable. Madison's investigation finally bore fruit on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her wedding. She appeared at my apartment door without warning, her face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. Gone was the radiant bride from the country club. In her place stood a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I know what you did," she said, pushing past me into the apartment. "I know about the contracts you signed, the people you're working with, the things you've agreed to do." I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, studying her with the same detached interest I developed for all my former relationships. "Do you? Don't play games with me." She turned to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I talked to Jennifer Walsh, and she told me about your conversation at the wedding, about how you said change was possible for people who wanted it badly enough. About how far you'd be willing to go. Jennifer has a good memory. She also has a good imagination, apparently. She's been having nightmares about you since the wedding. Dreams where you're not, where you're something else entirely. Madison's voice cracked slightly. She's not the only one. Emily, Ryan, Sarah, they're all saying the same thing. You're doing something to people, changing them, making them see things that aren't there. Or maybe they're finally seeing things that were always there, I suggested. Madison stared at me for a long moment, her breathing shallow and rapid. You sold your soul, didn't you? That's what this is about. You made some kind of deal, and now you're becoming something inhuman. The accusation should have been absurd, the kind of thing that belonged in horror movies rather than real life. But as I considered her words, I realized they contained a kernel of truth that I'd been avoiding confronting. I had made a deal. Not with the devil, perhaps, but with something equally transformative and dangerous. The phone number I'd called after receiving the wedding invitation had connected me to people who specialized in making impossible dreams come true. The only cost was everything I'd once considered myself to be. Does it matter? I asked. You wanted someone successful, someone who could give you the life you deserved, someone who could match your ambition and drive. Isn't that what you're looking at now? This isn't success, she whispered. This is something else. Something wrong. By whose definition? I moved closer to her, noting how she instinctively stepped back. 3 weeks ago, you married James Richardson because he represented security and status. But how secure do you feel now, knowing that someone you discarded as worthless can acquire more in a month than your husband's family has built in generations? Stop it. She pressed her hands against her ears as if my words were physically painful. You're not the person I knew. You're not even a person anymore. I'm exactly the person you wanted me to be, I said, my voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the air around us. Confident, successful, capable of commanding respect and attention. The only difference is that I achieved it through methods you don't understand. Madison's composure finally cracked completely. She collapsed into one of my second-hand chairs, her perfect composure dissolving into raw terror. What did they do to you? What did you become? I knelt beside her chair, close enough to see my reflection in her tear-filled eyes. The face looking back at me was handsome in an uncomfortable way, perfectly symmetrical, with features that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle of observation. It was my face, but refined, perfected, made into something that commanded attention and inspired unease in equal measure. I became what was necessary, I said softly. I became someone who couldn't be dismissed or ignored or discarded. Someone who matters. At what cost? She whispered. Everything, I admitted. But also nothing. The person you rejected never really existed anyway. He was just a collection of fears and limitations, a placeholder waiting for someone real to take his place. Madison looked up at me with eyes that no longer held any trace of the love we'd once shared. There was only horror now, and a dawning understanding that the man she'd known was truly gone, replaced by something that wore his face but served entirely different purposes. I'm sorry, she said, though I wasn't sure if she was apologizing for leaving me or for whatever she thought she'd driven me to become. Don't be, I replied, rising to my full height. You gave me the greatest gift possible. You showed me that the life I was living wasn't worth keeping. After Madison left that night, I never saw her again in person, but her influence rippled outward in ways I found increasingly fascinating. Within days, the friends and acquaintances who'd attended her wedding began experiencing what they described as vivid dreams and strange coincidences that all seemed to center around me. Emily Chin called to describe a recurring nightmare where I appeared in her marketing office, offering to help her acquire new clients through methods she couldn't quite remember upon waking. Ryan Thompson left rambling voicemails about business opportunities that seemed too good to be true, partnerships that could make them both wealthy beyond imagination if he was willing to make certain unspecified sacrifices. Sarah Kim posted cryptic messages on social media about the nature of success and the price of ambition, messages that grew more philosophical and unsettling with each passing day. Her friends began commenting with concern, noting that she seemed different, more intense, as if she was working through some fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. But the most interesting development was James Richardson himself. According to mutual acquaintances, Madison's new husband had become obsessed with finding out more about me, hiring private investigators and making inquiries through his family's business connections. The results of these investigations only deepened his confusion and fear. I had no verifiable employment history for the past 3 months, Yet I was clearly earning substantial income from unknown sources. The Lamborghini was registered to a company that existed only on paper, with ownership structures that led investigators in circles, each layer of corporate shell companies more mysterious than the last. More disturbing were the reports from people who'd interacted with me since the wedding. Bank employees described meetings they couldn't quite remember clearly, conversations that seemed to happen in a fog of confusion and compliance. Restaurant servers mentioned serving me meals I'd never ordered, bills that somehow paid themselves, interactions that left them feeling vaguely unsettled for reasons they couldn't articulate. I was becoming a void in the normal fabric of reality, a person-shaped absence that others filled with their own fears and desires. The more successful I appeared, the more unstable the world around me became, as if my transformation was pulling everything else out of alignment. The pattern was most visible in my old neighborhood, where I continued to maintain my apartment despite being able to afford much better accommodations. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, began having conversations with me in the hallway that she later couldn't remember. The mailman started delivering packages addressed to names I'd never used, items I'd never ordered, but somehow needed. Even my reflection had become unreliable. Some days I looked like the enhanced version of my former self, more handsome, more confident, more present. Other days I appeared almost translucent in mirrors, as if I was gradually fading from visible existence while becoming more powerful in other ways. The realization that something was fundamentally wrong should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a sense of completion. The old world, with its rigid rules about identity and possibility, was proving itself inadequate to contain what I was becoming. Reality itself was being forced to adapt to accommodate my transformation. 6 weeks after Madison's wedding, I received an unexpected visitor. James Richardson appeared at my apartment door on a Sunday morning, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual confidence had been replaced by hollow-eyed desperation, and his expensive clothes hung loosely on his frame as if he'd lost significant weight. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, pushing past me into the apartment. I closed the door and studied him with growing interest. This was Madison's perfect husband, the man who represented everything she'd wanted in a partner. Now he looked like a ghost of his former self, haunted by questions he couldn't answer and fears he couldn't name. "Madison's been having episodes," he continued, his voice cracking with strain. "She wakes up screaming your name, talking about deals and transformations and things that don't make sense. She won't eat, won't sleep properly, won't even look at me sometimes." "That sounds concerning," I replied, noting how he flinched at the sound of my voice. "The doctors say it's stress, maybe a delayed reaction to wedding planning and adjusting to married life. But I know it's more than that. It started the night she came to see you." He turned to face me fully, and I saw raw terror in his eyes. "What did you do to her?" "I told her the truth," I said simply. "People often find truth more disturbing than lies." "What truth? What are you talking about?" His voice rose to nearly a shout, desperation overriding his usual composure. "Madison was happy before she saw you at the wedding. We were happy. Everything was perfect until you showed up with that car and that smile and whatever the hell you've become." "Perfect," I repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what you called it? A perfect life built on perfect lies, sustained by perfect ignorance of what really drives people like Madison." James stared at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. "I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand what you've done or how you did it, but I know you're responsible for what's happening to my wife." "Your wife?" I mused. "Tell me, James, what do you think Madison saw in you? What made you worthy of her ambition and her carefully calculated affection?" "We love each other," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Do you? Or did you simply represent the most efficient path to the life she wanted?" I moved closer, noting how he instinctively stepped back. "Money, status, social connections, the approval of people who matter in your particular corner of the world. You were a solution to a problem, not a person she chose to love." "That's not true, isn't it? When she looks at you now, what do you see in her eyes? Love? Or the growing realization that she settled for safety when she could have had something extraordinary?" James's composure finally cracked completely. He collapsed into one of my chairs, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I just want my wife back. I want things to go back to the way they were." "That's impossible," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "Madison has seen what's possible now. She understands that the world is bigger and stranger and more dangerous than she ever imagined. She can't unknow that truth." "Then what am I supposed to do?" he whispered. I studied his broken form with something approaching pity. James Richardson was a decent man who'd done nothing wrong except being born into wealth and assuming that would be enough to guarantee happiness. He'd followed all the rules, met all the expectations, and built a life that should have satisfied any reasonable person. But Madison had never been reasonable, and neither had I. You could join her, I suggested. There are others like me, people who've discovered that transformation is possible for those willing to pay the price. Your money could buy you entrance to circles you've never imagined, power that makes your family's influence look like a child's game. What kind of price? He asked, though I could see he already suspected the answer. Everything you think you are, I replied. Everything you've been taught to value. Everything that makes you feel safe and normal and human. James looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. Are you still human? I considered the question seriously, running through inventory of what I'd lost and what I'd gained. The old me, the awkward, uncertain young man who loved Madison with desperate intensity, was gone. In his place was something more confident, more capable, more effective at getting what it wanted. But human? That was becoming an increasingly complex question. I'm what I chose to become, I said finally. The question is what you're willing to choose. James Richardson left my apartment that morning without giving me an answer, but I could see the seed of possibility taking root in his mind. Within a month, he would make his own call to the number I'd memorized but never shared. Within 2 months, he would begin his own transformation, driven by the same desperation that had once consumed me. Madison would disappear entirely shortly after that, leaving behind only rumors and speculation about a young woman who'd seemed to have everything but walked away from it all without explanation. Some said she'd suffered a nervous breakdown. Others whispered about involvement with dangerous people, about debts that couldn't be paid with money. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of their theories. Madison had finally understood the real nature of the game she'd been playing, and she'd chosen to stop playing it entirely. The influence spread like ripples in a pond, each person who encountered me carrying something away from the interaction, some fragment of understanding that changed how they saw the world. By autumn, 6 months after Madison's wedding, I could track the network of transformation spreading through Apex's social circles like a benevolent virus. Robert Hayes, my nervous bank manager, had been the first to fully succumb. His dreams about me had evolved into waking visions, moments of clarity where he understood that his small, safe life was a prison he'd built around himself. He began making different choices, riskier investments, unconventional partnerships, decisions that his old self would never have considered. His success was immediate and inexplicable. Clients who'd never spoken to him before sought out his services. Investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true proved to be exactly as profitable as they appeared. Within months, he'd transformed from a mid-level bank employee into one of the most sought-after financial advisors in the region. But the cost of that success was visible to anyone who looked closely. Robert's eyes had developed the same unsettling quality as mine. Too bright, too knowing, too capable of seeing through the comfortable lies people told themselves. His smile carried undertones of dark amusement, as if he was perpetually enjoying a private joke that others wouldn't understand. The pattern repeated itself across my expanding network. Emily Chin's marketing firm began attracting clients she'd never approached, companies that seemed to seek her out based on recommendations from sources she couldn't identify. Her campaigns achieved impossible results, viral marketing successes that defied explanation and generated revenue that exceeded her wildest projections. Ryan Thompson discovered new investment opportunities that consistently outperformed market expectations. Sarah Kim launched a fashion blog that gained millions of followers within weeks, brand partnerships materializing from companies that had never heard of her but somehow knew they needed her endorsement. Each success came with the same price: a gradual disconnection from their former selves, a growing awareness that they were becoming something other than what they'd once been. But unlike my transformation, which had been sudden and dramatic, theirs was gradual, almost imperceptible except to others who'd undergone the same process. We began meeting regularly, an informal group that gathered at expensive restaurants and private clubs around Apex. To outside observers, we appeared to be a successful networking group, young professionals who'd found ways to leverage each other's connections and expertise. The reality was more complex and more disturbing. We were becoming a hive mind of sorts, individuals who retained our separate identities but shared an underlying understanding of how the world really worked. We could sense opportunities that others missed, manipulate situations in ways that seemed like luck or coincidence, and attract success through methods that couldn't be explained through conventional business wisdom. The meetings themselves were exercises in controlled power, each person sharing their latest achievements while carefully avoiding discussion of the costs involved. We spoke in coded language about transformative experiences and paradigm shifts, euphemisms that allowed us to acknowledge what we'd become without having to confront the full implications. But beneath the surface camaraderie, I could sense competition and fear. Each person in our group was becoming more powerful, more capable of influencing the world around them, but also more isolated from normal human experience. We were losing the ability to connect with people who hadn't undergone similar transformations, becoming something like a separate species that happened to share the same physical space as regular humanity. The question that none of us wanted to ask was what would happen when our transformations reached their natural conclusion. We were becoming something post-human, but the destination remained unclear. Would we retain enough of our original selves to remember why we wanted to change in the first place? Or would we become something entirely alien, wearing human faces while serving purposes that our old selves wouldn't recognize? The answer came during our winter gathering, a private dinner at the Prestonwood Country Club where Madison's wedding had taken place. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. We were dining in the same location where my transformation had been publicly revealed, celebrating successes that would have been impossible in our former lives. The conversation was more animated than usual, each person sharing increasingly dramatic stories of their achievements. Robert had just closed a deal that would make him one of the wealthiest financial advisors in North Carolina. Emily's marketing firm had been acquired by a multinational corporation for an amount that exceeded her previous annual revenue. Ryan had launched a hedge fund that was already attracting institutional investors despite having no track record. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in my companions that went beyond their professional successes. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, as if they were all responding to the same unheard rhythm. Their laughter synchronized in ways that suggested shared thoughts rather than shared amusement. When they spoke, their words seemed to overlap and echo, creating harmonies that human voices shouldn't be able to produce. Most disturbing was the way they looked at the country club staff and other diners. There was no malice in their expressions, but there was also no recognition of shared humanity. They studied normal people the way scientists might observe laboratory specimens, with clinical interest but no emotional connection. I realized with growing alarm that I was looking at them the same way. The transformation was reaching its final stage, and we were losing the last vestiges of what had made us human. Our enhanced capabilities came at the cost of our ability to empathize, to connect, to feel genuine emotion rather than approximations of feeling designed to achieve specific goals. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead I felt only a cool satisfaction. This was what I'd chosen, what I'd paid for with everything I'd once been. The scared, uncertain young man who loved Madison Hayes was gone, replaced by something more effective, more powerful, more capable of getting what it wanted. But as I sat there surrounded by others who'd made similar choices, I couldn't remember what it was that I'd wanted in the first place. The dinner ended with our usual ritual, each person making a toast to continued success and mutual prosperity. But the words felt hollow now, meaningless sounds that we produced out of habit rather than genuine sentiment. We were becoming perfect, but perfection was turning out to be a form of death. As I drove home in my Lamborghini, I caught glimpses of my reflection in the various mirrors and windows. The face looking back at me was handsome, confident, successful, everything I'd once dreamed of becoming. But it was also empty, a mask worn by something that no longer remembered what it felt like to be human. The city lights blurred past as I accelerated through the empty streets, chasing something I couldn't name toward a destination I couldn't visualize. Behind me, the country club grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but I could still feel the presence of my companions, a network of consciousness that stretched across Apex like a web of transformation and loss. We had become everything we'd wanted to be, and in doing so, we'd stopped being anything at all. 1 year after Madison's wedding, I received another cream-colored invitation, this one addressed in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The paper felt familiar between my fingers, expensive and substantial, embossed with gold lettering that seemed to shift and change as I read it. You are cordially invited to witness the next phase of transformation. The gathering will take place at the coordinates of your choosing, at the time of your greatest need. Dress code. Everything you've ever wanted to become. I understood immediately what the invitation meant. The network we built was ready to expand beyond Apex, beyond the small circle of individuals who'd been lucky enough to encounter me during my own transformation. Others were waiting for their chance to transcend the limitations of ordinary existence, to discover what was possible when you stopped accepting the boundaries that others had drawn around your life. The old me would have been horrified by the implications, but the old me had been weak, uncertain, content to accept rejection and limitation as natural parts of existence. The person I'd become understood that evolution required leaving the past behind, regardless of the cost. I began making preparations for the next phase, researching individuals who showed the right combination of ambition and desperation. College students drowning in debt and limited prospects. Middle-aged professionals trapped in careers that would never fulfill their dreams. Entrepreneurs whose businesses had failed despite their best efforts. People who were ready to pay any price for the chance to become something more than they were. The methods I'd learned were infinitely adaptable. A chance encounter at a coffee shop, a mysterious business card left behind after a conversation, a phone number that appeared in someone's contacts without explanation. Each person would make their own choice, follow their own path to transformation, discover their own version of what I'd become. Some would resist the change, clinging to their human limitations out of fear or misplaced loyalty to their former selves. Those individuals would be left behind, forgotten casualties of their own lack of vision. But others would embrace the opportunity, surrendering everything they'd been for the chance to become everything they'd dreamed of being. And with each new transformation, the network would grow stronger, more capable of reshaping the world according to our enhanced understanding of what was possible. We were becoming the architects of a new reality, one where success was limited only by imagination and the willingness to pay the necessary price. Madison had been right about me after all. I had lacked ambition, direction, purpose. But I'd found all three in ways she'd never imagined possible. The nobody she dismissed at her wedding had become something that could remake the world itself. The only question now is whether there would be anyone left to appreciate what we'd accomplished. As you've read this story, you've likely recognized something of yourself in the narrator's journey. The frustration of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed by people who couldn't see your true potential. The desire to prove them wrong, to show them what you're really capable of becoming. The transformation described in these pages isn't merely fiction. It's a metaphor for the real changes that are possible when you stop accepting the limitations others have placed on your life. While you may not have access to mysterious phone numbers or supernatural bargains, you do have something equally powerful, the ability to choose who you become. Success isn't about the car you drive or the suit you wear, though those can be powerful symbols of internal change. Real transformation happens when you stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start recognizing yourself as the architect of your own reality. Every day, you make choices that either reinforce your current limitations or push you towards something greater. Every interaction is an opportunity to present yourself as someone who deserves respect, attention, and success. Every setback is a chance to demonstrate that you're the kind of person who doesn't accept defeat as final. The narrator's journey from nobody to somebody required him to surrender everything he'd once been. Your transformation may require similar sacrifices, outdated beliefs about what you deserve, comfortable relationships that keep you small, safe habits that prevent you from taking necessary risks. But unlike the narrator, you get to choose what you become without losing your humanity in the process. You can develop confidence without becoming callous, achieve success without sacrificing your ability to connect with others, transform yourself without transforming into something unrecognizable. The first step is the hardest, deciding that you deserve better than what you currently have. The second step is easier, taking action to make that decision a reality. Your ex may have called you a nobody. Your former friends may have dismissed your potential. The world may have overlooked your worth. But you know better. And now it's time to show them what you're really capable of becoming. The invitation to transform your life doesn't require mysterious phone numbers or supernatural assistance. It only requires your willingness to stop being who you've always been and start becoming who you've always known you could be. The choice, as always, is yours. But choose quickly. The world is changing, and those who don't evolve with it risk being left behind entirely. Your transformation starts now.